I was born on the 23rd day of March, 1867, in a wooden house on Rincon Hill, San Francisco. My father, Cornelius Whitfield, everyone called him Connie. He used to say I came into this world screaming, like I already knew what kind of city I'd landed in. Well, maybe he was right about that. Now, you have to understand something. By the time I drew my first breath, the big rush was over. The 49ers, the original ones who came running when Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill, they were already old men by then, some of them rich beyond imagination, most of them broken. But the city still hummed with it. You could feel it in the streets, in the way people walked, in the look behind their eyes. Gold fever doesn't go away just because the gold runs out. It changes shape, that's all. My father arrived in San Francisco in the spring of 1851. He was 19 years old, came all the way from a farm outside of Baltimore with nothing but a canvas bag, and, well, more hope than sense, I suppose. He didn't find gold. Not the kind you dig out of the ground. Anyway, what he found was that miners need boots. They need shovels. They need flour and salt pork and whiskey. So he stopped digging and started selling. By the time he met my mother, Louisa May Brennan, fresh off a ship from County Cork, he owned a general store on Montgomery Street and had money enough to marry. My mother never talked much about Ireland. I learned early not to ask. But she talked about San Francisco. She described the city in 1856, when she first saw it from the deck of that ship. The hills covered with tents and shanties, smoke rising everywhere, the bay so crowded with abandoned ships that you could walk across their decks from one pier to another. Men had sailed in from everywhere, she said, then just left their boats rotting in the water, because the gold was more important than going home. Some of those ships, they sank right there, and they built the city on top of them. I always thought about that as a boy. A city built on drowned ships. There's something in that, I think. I grew up hearing stories. That's what you need to understand. Before I knew how to read, I knew about the Comstock Lode. I knew about the vigilance committees. I knew which men on Nob Hill had blood on their hands, and which ones just had luck. The gold rush wasn't history to me. It was the air I breathed. It was the shadow my father cast when he came home tired, counting coins at the kitchen table, building something out of nothing in a city that promised everything and delivered. Well, that's the story I'm trying to tell you. The San Francisco of my boyhood. Now that was something to see. I'm talking about the early 70s, 1871, 72, around there. The city had burned down 6 times before I was born. Did you know that? 6 times. And each time they built it back bigger, louder, more stubborn than before. By the time I was old enough to run through those streets, it was a proper city, or at least it was trying to be. Gas lamps on the main avenues. Cable cars climbing up hills so steep, you'd think God was playing a joke on the engineers. Mansions going up on Nob Hill, one after another, each railroad baron trying to outdo the last. But you walk 4 blocks in the wrong direction, and you're in the Barbary Coast, where a man could lose his wallet, his dignity, and his life, sometimes all in the same evening. I had a friend named Alonzo Fong. Everyone called him Lonnie. His father ran a laundry on DuPont Street, which is what they called Grant Avenue back then, right in the heart of Chinatown. Now, I know what you're thinking. And yes, it was unusual in those days. A white boy and a Chinese boy running together. My mother didn't mind. God rest her soul. She said the Irish knew what it was like to be looked down upon, so he had no business doing it to others. My father, well, he had his opinions, but he kept them to himself mostly. Lonnie and I, we must have covered every inch of that city on foot. We knew which bakeries would give you day-old bread for free. We knew which sailors just off the ships had money burning holes in their pockets and would pay a nickel for directions they didn't need. We knew where the old men gathered to tell stories, and that was worth more than any nickel. There was a man named Jedediah Crocker who lived in a boarding house near Pacific Street, right on the edge of what decent folks called the Devil's Playground. Jed was a 49er, one of the real ones, came overland in 1849 when he was 23 years old. By the time I knew him, he was in his 50s, maybe 60s, looked about 100. His hands shook when he lifted a glass, and he lifted a glass often. But when he talked about the old days, something changed in him. His eyes would clear up, his voice would steady, and Lonnie and I would sit there on overturned crates, not moving, barely breathing, just listening. He told us about panning for gold in the American River, about men who struck it rich on Monday and were dead broke by Friday. He told us about the ships rotting in the bay, just like my mother described, how some of them got dragged onto land and turned into hotels and warehouses. He said he once slept in what used to be a cargo hold, woke up with rats the size of cats staring at him. I don't know if that was true. Probably not all of it, but the feeling of it, the wildness of those early days, that came through clear as a bell. And then there was Dona Esperanza Villarreal, a Mexican widow who ran a boarding house up on Telegraph Hill. She made the best tortillas I ever tasted in my life, before or since. She had a photograph of her husband on the wall, a man with a thick mustache who died in the mines back in '53. She never remarried. She used to tell me, in that accent of hers that mixed Spanish and English like shuffling cards, "This city takes and takes, mio. You have to decide what you're willing to give." I didn't understand what Dona Esperanza meant by that. Not really. Not until the summer of 1877. I was 10 years old enough to start noticing things that children aren't supposed to notice. Old enough to listen at doors when my parents thought I was asleep. Old enough to see that my father's hands, the same hands that counted coins so carefully at the kitchen table, those hands weren't entirely clean. It started with a conversation I overheard one August evening. My father had a visitor, a man named Hobbs, thin as a rail, with a voice like gravel scraping on tin. They were in the parlor, and I was supposed to be in bed, but the heat was unbearable that night, the kind of heat that makes you feel like the whole city is holding its breath. So I crept down the stairs and sat in the shadows, listening. Hobbs was talking about the old days, about 1852, about a claim dispute up near Hangtown. And my father who taught me to say my prayers every night and never tell a lie, he laughed and said, "Well, Marcus John isn't around to dispute it anymore, is he?" And Hobbs laughed too, and they clinked their glasses, and something inside me went cold. I didn't know exactly what they meant. I was 10, but I knew enough. I knew that laugh wasn't the laugh of innocent men. That same summer, the city started to turn ugly in a way I hadn't seen before. There had always been tension, always been men who looked at the Chinese and saw something less than human. But in '77, it boiled over. Dennis Kearney, that Irish rabble-rouser, he started holding rallies down by the sandlots, screaming about how the Chinese were stealing jobs, how they needed to go. The Chinese must go. That was his slogan, and men repeated it like a prayer. I remember standing on a street corner one July evening, watching a mob form, torches flickering in the dusk, and I thought about Lonnie. I thought about his father's laundry on DuPont Street. I thought about the way Lonnie's mother always smiled at me and gave me almond cookies, even though they had so little. The riots came on the 23rd of July. I remember the date because it was exactly 4 months after my birthday, and I remember thinking, in that strange way children think, that the city was giving me some kind of terrible gift. They burned the lumber yard first, then turned toward Chinatown. Lonnie's family, they barricaded themselves inside their laundry with a few other families, maybe 15 people in a space meant for 5. I wanted to go to them. I begged my father to do something, to help, but he grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises and said, "You stay out of this, Ezra. This isn't our fight." But it was my fight. Lonnie was my friend. So I waited until my father fell asleep, and I climbed out my window, and I ran through streets that smelled like smoke and rage until I reached DuPont Street. I couldn't get through. The police had set up a line, not to protect the Chinese, but to keep the violence from spreading to the white neighborhoods. I stood there for hours, watching, helpless, 10 years old, and learning what that word really means. Lonnie survived. His family survived. But something between us changed after that. He looked at me differently, and I couldn't blame him. His people had been attacked, and my people had either done the attacking or stood by and watched. We stayed friends, but there was a wall now, invisible but solid, built out of things neither of us knew how to say. Old Jed Crocker died that November. Lonnie and I went to see him one last time, about a week before the end. He was lying in that cramped room in the boarding house, barely able to lift his head, but still telling stories. His last story, the one I remember clearest, was about a man he knew in '51, a Chinese miner named Chun, who worked a claim up near Hangtown. "Hardest working man I ever saw," Jed said. "Someone jumped his claim, drove him off. Never saw him again. He didn't know I was listening for that name. He didn't know what it meant to me. But when he said it, I felt my father's shadow fall across me, even though my father was nowhere near that room. I carried that shadow for a long time. My father died in 1889, never knowing that I knew. My mother followed him 3 years later, and I was left with a store on Montgomery Street, a house on Rincon Hill, and a truth I couldn't speak to anyone. I built a life. I married a woman named Clara in '94, a schoolteacher with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. We had 2 children, a boy and a girl. I became respectable, or at least I wore the costume of respectability well enough that no one looked too closely. The years passed the way years do when you're busy living them, fast and slow at the same time, and before I knew it, I was 39 years old, and the century had turned, and San Francisco was bigger and prouder than ever. Electric lights replacing gas lamps, automobiles appearing on streets that used to belong to horses, and everyone talking about the future like it was a train that would never stop. Then came the morning of April 18th, 1906. I was awake before dawn, couldn't sleep, something restless in my bones that I couldn't name. Clara was beside me, breathing soft and steady. The children were down the hall. And then, at 12 minutes past 5 in the morning, the world shook. Not trembled, not swayed, shook, like God had grabbed the city in both hands and was trying to tear it apart. I've heard people describe earthquakes since then, read accounts in newspapers and books, but none of them get it right. It wasn't just the shaking, it was the sound. A roar that came from everywhere and nowhere, from beneath us and above us, the sound of the earth itself screaming. It lasted maybe 45 seconds, maybe a minute, I don't know. Time stopped meaning anything. When it ended, when the shaking finally stopped, I found myself on the floor, Clara beside me, both of us covered in plaster dust, and for a moment there was silence, perfect silence, and then the screaming started. The house was damaged, but standing. We got the children out, got ourselves out onto the street, and that's when I saw the smoke. Not one column, not 2, but dozens, rising all across the city, and I knew, we all knew, that the shaking was only the beginning. The fires burned for 3 days. 3 days. I watched neighborhoods I had known my entire life disappear into ash. I watched men dynamite buildings to create fire breaks, watched them fail, watched the flames jump across streets like they were nothing. I worked alongside strangers, passing buckets, pulling survivors from rubble, doing whatever needed to be done. Sleep became a memory. Food became an afterthought. Somewhere in those endless hours, I lost track of Clara and the children. We got separated in the chaos near Market Street, and I spent 6 hours convinced I had lost everything. 6 hours that aged me 10 years. When I found them again, in a makeshift camp near the Presidio, I held them so tight I thought I might break them, and I didn't care. It was in one of those camps that I met Reverend Thaddeus Oakley, a Negro preacher from a Baptist church down in the Fillmore district. His church had burned, same as everything else, but he was still preaching, standing on an overturned crate, telling people that the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, and that we were all still here, still breathing, and that meant something. I'm not what you'd call a religious man, never have been, but something about his voice cut through the smoke and the grief. I listened. A lot of us did. And there was a nurse working those camps, a young Irish woman named Margaret Sullivan. Everyone called her Maggie. She couldn't have been more than 25, and she moved through the wounded like she had done this 1,000 times before. She hadn't. She told me later she was terrified every moment of those 3 days, but she never let it show. Hands steady, voice calm. I watched her save lives with nothing but bandages, clean water, and sheer stubborn will. On the 3rd day, I found Lonnie again. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I'd married, not since life had pulled us in different directions the way it does. But there he was, covered in soot, helping to salvage what he could from a building near Portsmouth Square. And when our eyes met, that invisible wall I told you about, the one built in 77, it crumbled. Just like that. He grabbed my hand, I grabbed his, and neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. We rebuilt. That's what San Francisco does. That's what it has always done. The fires burned out, the smoke cleared, and before the ashes were cold, men were already drawing up plans, already arguing about what the new city would look like. I lost the store on Montgomery Street, lost the house on Rincon Hill, lost nearly everything my father had built, and everything I had added to it. But I had Clara. I had my children. I had Lonnie back in my life after all those years. And I had something else, something I found in the ruins of my father's study about a week after the fires died down. A metal box, fireproof, the kind men used to store important documents. Inside, there was a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I never opened it. I know that sounds strange. I've had 48 years to open that letter, and I never have. Part of me knows what it probably says. Part of me doesn't want to know for certain. Some truths are easier to carry when they're not written down in black and white. Maybe that's cowardice. Maybe it's wisdom. At 87 years old, I still can't tell the difference. I'm looking out my window now, and the city I see bears almost no resemblance to the city I was born in. The hills are the same, I suppose. The bay is the same. But everything else, the buildings, the bridges, the noise and the rush of it all, it's like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. The gold rush, the 49ers, old Jed Crocker and his stories, Dona Esperanza and her tortillas, the riots of 77, the earthquake and the fire. All of it feels like something I read in a book rather than something I lived. But I did live it. These hands, shaking now the way Yet's hands used to shake, these hands touched that history. These eyes saw it. My grandson, he's 12 years old now, same age I was when I started to understand what kind of city I lived in. He asks me questions sometimes about the old days, about what it was like, and I try to tell him, try to find the words. But how do you explain to a boy in 1954 what it felt like to grow up in a city built on gold and greed and drowned ships and broken promises? How do you explain that the same place that made men rich destroyed them? That the same streets where fortunes were born were soaked in blood that nobody talks about anymore? I tell him what I can. I tell him the city takes and takes, just like Dona Esperanza told me. And I tell him he has to decide what he's willing to give. I hope he understands. I hope he remembers. That's all any of us can do in the end. Remember, and hope someone's listening.